Ethereum is about to receive its next big update, Pectra. And technically, Pectra is the largest update Ethereum has ever seen, featuring 11 different EIPs or changes. But what do these changes do, and what will they mean for Ethereum and its users? That's what I'm going to explore today. As with all updates since the merge, Pectra is actually a pair of upgrades, one to the execution layer and one to the consensus layer. These are called Prague and Electra respectively, and I've talked about how these names come about before. But unlike some previous updates, Pectra lacks a dramatic headline feature for everyone to focus on. Instead, it's better thought of as a collection of iterative improvements to various aspects of the Ethereum system, such as accounts, staking, and blobs. Staking will see the biggest changes, with 5 different EIPs affecting this area. However, most users won't notice these. Instead, they're most likely to experience and benefit from an EIP introducing some account abstraction features, but more on that later. Interestingly, despite being chock full of changes as it is, Pectra was almost even larger. At one point, almost twice as many EIPs were considered for inclusion, before it was whittled down due to concerns about doing too much at once. It has also faced a rather rocky road to mainnet, with 2 testnets suffering incidents after receiving the update. But it should be noted that neither of those incidents were directly because of issues in Pectra itself, and it has now been successfully run on a newly launched testnet called Hoodie. Now, with all of that background out of the way, let's explore some of Pectra's biggest features. Because it's likely to be the most noticeable change, let's start by looking at EIP 7702, which enables users to transform their normal, boring wallets into smart wallets with all sorts of fancy features. Essentially, it's the first step towards widespread account abstraction on Ethereum. See, in Ethereum, traditional accounts controlled by private keys that are held in user wallets are known as externally owned accounts, or EOAs. If you've ever used Ethereum or any similar chains, then you've probably done that using an EOA, and so you'll know that they're pretty limited in what they can do. They certainly don't have smart features like the ability to batch multiple transactions or pay fees in different assets. 7702 will change this by introducing a new type of transaction that lets users delegate control of their EOA to a chosen smart contract, giving their account the smart contract's features and abilities. Crucially, the user remains in full control at all times. Their account is ultimately still controlled by their private key. If a user wants to retract their delegation, they can simply sign a new transaction to do that. The idea is that users will opt into smart wallets with programmable features. These can include gas sponsorship, where apps cover transaction fees so users can pay in whatever asset they like, transaction batching, which will remove the need to sign separate approval and swap transactions, as well as spending limits and other security and account recovery features. As I understand, some developers wanted to push things even further by introducing more ambitious changes relating to account abstraction. And maybe those changes will come in time, but the beauty of 7702 and the reason it was included in Pectra is that it fits cleanly into Ethereum's existing account infrastructure. Users can benefit from smart wallet features without having to migrate funds to a new address or deploying expensive smart contract wallets. Ultimately, it's a kind of best of both worlds approach that should bring some quality of life improvement to Ethereum users. I'm excited to see what's built with it. As mentioned earlier, staking is Pectra's biggest beneficiary, with 5 EIPs targeting this area, but one of those changes stands out above the rest. EIP 7251. This raises validators' maximum effective balance, effectively the amount that they can stake, from 32 to 2048 ETH. Today, all Ethereum validators, the people who help produce blocks and keep the network running, have an effective balance of 32 ETH. In other words, any ETH they hold or earn above this threshold doesn't count towards their voting power or make them any more likely to produce blocks. It's essentially wasted ETH. Therefore, anyone with more than 32 ETH would need to run multiple validators if they want to stake it all. So someone with 64 ETH would need to run 2 validators, somebody with 96 ETH would need to run 3 validators, and so on. That's not a great UX for stakers, who may have to manage multiple validators at the same time, and probably on the same machine. Worse still, it's harmful for the Ethereum network, because all of those validators have to communicate and sign messages once every epoch, or every 32 blocks. So there are a lot of messages being passed around, and a lot of bandwidth being consumed quite unnecessarily. If everyone running multiple validators could consolidate their balances, it would significantly reduce those bandwidth requirements. Then, that bandwidth could be repurposed in more useful ways, such as increasing the size of blocks to squeeze in more transactions and reduce fees. And that's exactly what EIP 7251 does. By increasing the maximum effective balance from 32 to 2048 ETH, the update will enable many validators to consolidate their balance onto one account. Plus, smaller stakers will be able to make the most of their earnings, as every additional ETH they earn will count towards their staking balance. A validator's voting power and probability of choosing a block will both scale with the number of ETH they stake. So someone with the maximum of 2048 ETH will weigh 64 times as much as someone with a 32 ETH validator. It's important to note that none of this changes the security or decentralization of Ethereum. The number of actual people behind the validators will stay the same. They're just going to work much more efficiently. Some additional tweaks are required to get this working properly. For instance, the slashing risk for large stakers has increased slightly, and so the slashing penalty per ETH staked has been reduced to account for that. The EIP would also enable partial withdrawals and let users set a ceiling for their balance, after which any ETH earned could be withdrawn. The other changes to staking are much smaller. EIP 7002 will let validators control withdrawals using smart contracts on the execution layer rather than on the consensus layer, for example. And EIP 6110 fixes some technical debt from the pre-merge world, enabling faster and less complex deposits. The other update that's worth talking about is the changes to blobs and call data that are coming with Pectra. Blobs are the containers attached to Ethereum blocks that hold arbitrary data. Because they can be safely discarded after a short time, they don't hurt Ethereum as much as call data, which lets users store information inside of blocks. Therefore, blob storage can be offered at a much lower price compared to call data, which makes it ideal for L2s and their data needs. I discussed this in a previous video. Currently, Ethereum aims for 3 blobs per block and allows a maximum of 6 blobs per block. Pectra will change this. EIP 7691 will double the target blob count to 6 per block, with a new maximum of 9 blobs per block. That means Ethereum's data capacity will increase, making life a little bit easier for its growing L2 ecosystem. However, it's not a game changer, and most Ethereum developers would happily admit to this. Really, this is just a temporary increase to keep things running until PIADAS arrives in Ethereum's next big upgrade, which should allow for even greater blob capacity. At the same time, EIP 7623 will increase the cost of in-block call data storage, helping to offset the impact of the additional blobs in worst-case scenarios. Currently, call data is priced at 16 gas per byte. Therefore, with the current 36 million gas block size, a block could conceivably be as large as 2.2 megabytes plus blobs. 7623 will raise this to 40 gas per byte, capping blocks to a 0.9 megabyte plus blob size. Those smaller blocks are just a little bit easier for the network to handle, again keeping those bandwidth constraints in mind. Together, this pair of upgrades will encourage Layer 2s to exclusively use blobs for their data storage needs, but the majority of users and transactions will remain entirely unaffected. And that's really it for Pectra. Of course, there are other changes in there, but they're not particularly exciting for most people. And frankly, I don't think Pectra is particularly exciting to most people. As I said back at the start, there aren't any dramatic or exciting updates in there. It's just a collection of iterative improvements to Ethereum. On its own, that wouldn't be a problem. But Pectra arrives at a difficult time for Ethereum. Competitors like Celestia, and especially Solana, are putting Ethereum under more pressure than ever before, and even surpassing it in some key areas. Markets are punishing ETH for its inability to capture value from Layer 2s, and its failure to compete with Bitcoin as a new form of money, and the vibes have generally deteriorated, with many Ethereans looking a little bit lost lately. To sum it all up, Ethereum needs some dramatic changes to reset its narratives and re-energize its community, and Pectra certainly won't do that. To be fair to them, the Ethereum Foundation and many leading developers have finally recognized the problems and are talking a good game. But actions matter so much more than words, and the changes they talk about are going to take time to be delivered. There's a real chance that in the meantime, lackluster and uninspired updates like Pectra will be fuel on the fire for Ethereum's critics. The changes that Ethereans are talking about now need to be delivered today, not in 5 years' time. And so the summary is, Pectra delivers some sensible and useful changes that will make Ethereum more efficient and introduce some additional functionality. but it's not the game changer that Ethereum needs right now to reverse its fortunes.